Let's see. Okay, this is fragment 2, actually, from game 4. Fragment 1 is also up on the web, on the Blackboard site, and I'll put it up next time for you. But these PowerPoints were pre-organized, so we don't want to risk trying to reopen the last one because of the problems we've been having here. So I'll find you fragment 1, but it's on the website. And the fragment games you folks can bring up after class. So today's lecture I had called, and it'll allow me to come back to that little piece, the Socialist Republic of New York City. Social movements come together in the late 1920s and the 1930s in the midst of a deep depression that found 1 out of every 3 New Yorkers out of work. These social movements came together, however, to create a social polity that would distinguish New York City in the nation's history as the bastion of liberalism, as the fount of what historians have called the semi-welfare state. That's to say, unlike welfare states, say in Sweden and elsewhere, noting that it was always quite incomplete, provided limited services, especially limited for women and especially limited for people of color in America, and always maintaining a limited role for the private sector as well. Much of this movement responded to pressure from below, but it was augmented by that group that we ended with last time, the Bobos, as they're called, the Bohemian bourgeois. That's to say, the people in the village who were often people of affluence and yet were progressive reformers with conservative impulses to the extent to which part of their objective was to create an alternative to groups like the industrial workers of the world or even to the Communist Party. So what we will have is a movement from below that will gain some impetus from the Communist Party, but will gain some impetus from people who are really not in support at all of what the communists were in favor of, and we're hoping to support a program that on some level would satisfy the social concerns or people animated by social concerns, and yet at the same time not undermine the free market. That's to say, they wanted to create a benign form or a healthy form of capitalist economy. They were arguing effectively that the problem wasn't industrial capitalism, the problem was some bad capitalists. It required not throwing out the system, it required reforming the system. And so it's a mixture of what we would call reformists and radicals, if you'd like. These people gained some of their experience from New York City in the decades prior to the New Deal that we've talked about, in particular, things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which you may recall profoundly affected women like Frances Perkins, who briefly joined the Socialist Party, voted for Eugene Debs in 1920, the leader of the Socialist Party, even when Debs was in jail, but decided ultimately that the practical politics of the Democratic Party was in fact the vehicle that she would support for a new role for the state, and she will become the first woman member of the cabinet in the New Deal. She honed her teeth as a reformer in the events following the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. The Factory Investigation Committee from 1911 to 1915 looked at the conditions that had led to the fire and to these enormous protests in the streets, and as you will recall, led to laws providing health and safety for women and children, what was called, as you may recall, protective legislation. Okay? It wasn't, again, legislation meant to throw out the system. It was meant, in fact, to make sure that people who they believed most vulnerable, women and children, would be protected. And men trade unionists could support this because on the whole they wanted their women folk at home. So it was paternalistic legislation at its base. And that would come through for the notion of the New Deal state as it would emerge on some level as a state to protect women and children, the kiddie state as we would call it, or protective state. The other person, in 1918, I just should mention, Governor Al Smith from New York appointed Perkins to the New York State Industrial Commission. She becomes its chair in 26. And in 1933, she becomes this first cabinet member. She is the first Secretary of Labor during the New Deal. Appointed again by somebody who had been the New York State governor, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When he becomes president, he brings her into his cabinet. The Triangle Fire, you may recall, affects a second major New York reformer who will be influential in creating legislation we identify with the New Deal, and that was Robert Wagner, whose son will also become a mayor in New York City in the 60s, we'll talk about later. Wagner was an immigrant with parents from Germany, graduates from City College and the New York Law School, and in 1911, as the leader of the state Senate in New York, he's the one who chairs this Factory Investigation Committee from 1911. He will then go on in the New Deal to author the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, or later often known simply as the NRA, or the National Recovery Act, a set of policies that began to legitimize and argue that the state had to take a role in stimulating reform. Much of that stimulus in the initial legislation was simply to be a model to chastise people by putting a blue eagle, to encourage people, a blue eagle sign on your window or on your door to indicate that you were loyal and that you expected people in a patriotic way to abide by the needs and concerns of labor, of Okies, of the unemployed. It didn't actually have any teeth. It rather suggested that people needed to change their way of thinking to embrace the needs of the poor. But it would quickly, under Wagner, in what would often be called the Second New Deal, after 36, actually take formal social policy in something that we call the Wagner Act, that had a couple of cornerstones of social policy to this day that mark the state as playing a role, at least, in trying to be regulatory. One key piece was the National Labor Relations Board, which is created in 1935. Now, they always imperfectly understood these boards, and none of that would be any more clear by the fact that subsequent presidents who were hostile to it would simply appoint to the board pro-business leaders. So when NYU's graduate students, for instance, unionized in the year 2000, the board had been created by Clinton, and so they got the kind of ruling that encouraged unionization because that was what, in fact, Roosevelt had in place. When that ruling was appealed by NYU, the board changed and George Bush appointed non-union people to the board, anti-union people to the board, and the graduate students lost on their appeal, and that's why there is no union among graduate students here. It's not a matter of whether you like it or don't like it, it's about how that history has changed. Just in the last week, when the Senate adjourned, President Obama used the recess to appoint new members of that board who the Republicans had blocked when they were in session. And so that board again is going to change. So there was nothing that made the board left or right, but it did suggest that the state was going to play a role. Okay? The state could choose to play different roles, but it suggested that the state was to have a role in 35. Yes? National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, it's often referred to. He also, by the way, sponsored a federal anti-lynching law, Wagner. But it's worth noting that FDR opposed it, refused to support it, for fear that he'd lose the support of his Southern Democrats. The Democratic Party had a firm base in the South. So it's instructive just to remember that legislation is being passed, but it always had a soft racial underbelly that really limited the effects of this kind of New Deal legislation. Nonetheless, they put in place some very powerful new notions of entitlement that we live with today. Social Security, Didn't exist before this. Okay? The idea that that people ought to have pensions and that the state ought to assure that everyone had a minimum pension that's a whole different set of ideas. They're all coming out of New York State, which is pioneering with these things, FDR. Creating a minimum wage. Again, remember, this would be reformist. This wasn't what the radicals, the IWW's position was to abolish the wage system. Not to have a minimum wage because they said, well, they'll just increase prices. Nonetheless, the suggestion here in this reformist impulse was to suggest that, in fact, there ought to always be a minimum that people ought to be paid for their labor. It was a constraint on the free market. It would operate, quote, freely, but above that minimum. So there was a minimum wage. Family assistance plans. What you will now know what has come to be called in the modern era, what we simply call welfare, were actually family assistance plans. Again, oriented, much as we would think in terms of social policy today, as pro-family policies, to enable families to stay together and support their children. And jobs programs. The model really for the kind of legislation that was at least being debated in Congress comes out of the 30s. Things like Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, WPA, etc. Actual jobs being created to build America's parks, bridges, but to hire artists, including people who were involved in things like making films. The most famous of the WPA guides, for instance, is the Guide to New York City that all of you could go up on Amazon and buy. And it's basically a walking guide to New York City that the WPA funded in the 30s. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It allows you to go back to the streets that you're living on and see how they were, in fact, what they were like in the mid-1930s, what was there, what was being remembered and memorialized as significant in the 1930s is worth seeing. The most famous case of an artist being supported, in fact, was an artist in New York City being supported by a private investor. It was at Rockefeller Center, and it was a mural being built by Diego Rivera, a Spanish artist. It was commissioned by Nelson Rockefeller to be in Rockefeller Center. The subject of the mural was described in the following words, quote, human intelligence in control of the forces of nature. So it was meant to be a mural that suggested how man could, in fact, be the master of the raw, unbridled forces of nature. It was 63 feet by 17 feet. And the problem is that when Rockefeller went and saw the mural, in the center of the mural, amidst a host of other kinds of images, was a portrait of Vladimir Lenin. This was not exactly what Nelson Rockefeller had in mind. So on May 22nd, 1933, Rivera was called down from his scaffold where he was still working, putting the finishing touches on his mural, and he was handed a check for $14,000, the balance of his fee, and informed that he had been dismissed. Within 30 minutes, the mural was covered by tar paper and a wooden screen. Rockefeller then meets with Rivera and tries to find a compromise. Can we do anything about that image to make it a more successful? I don't want to destroy the artwork. I just want it to be something that I can respect and that American people can respect. We want it to be an American mural. Rivera, he asked him to replace Lenin with some unknown face, some anonymous American who could speak to everyone. The artist offered to add Lincoln, but refused to expunge Lenin. He said, I'll make it Lincoln and Lenin. Sounds like the L word, right? The Lincoln and Lenin means. He was charged instead with willful propagandizing, to which he responds, all art is propaganda. That didn't satisfy Rockefeller, and since Rivera had been paid, he was unable to force the Rockefellers to exhibit it or keep his work, and the mural was subsequently removed, destroyed. Pressure from below extended, however, well beyond the forces of the liberals and extended to a series of groups that I want to talk about, and I want to suggest something of the kinds of accomplishments and achievements that made New York distinctive from almost any other city in the United States and became part of its character, a character that some celebrated and some stigmatized the city for having, as you know. Radicals were committed to various forms of socialism. And following the excitement of the Russian Revolution in 1917, they sought to build a model outside of Russia. And a left-wing group created the Communist Labor Party. It was based initially in Cleveland, but its secretary was Brooklyn's Edward Lingen. He's eventually arrested and jailed and sent off with the Red Scare in 1920. But the party headquarters are moved to New York City in 1919. And New York City becomes the home of the American Communist Party, and by far the largest number of communists are also in New York City, and New York City more broadly constructed. So it's also the home of American capitalism, and it's the home of American communism. And they're often cheek to jowl, as we've suggested. The Communist Party and its New York City followers and its Bobo supporters, because as I've mentioned, people like Perkins are socialists. The socialists were sometimes aligned with the communists, and sometimes they're bitter enemies. And it changes from time to time. And they were involved in the Passaic strike, as you saw. They go out to Passaic, and they come back to show this film in order to build a movement. And what we have in that film I wanted to try to suggest is the beginnings of what we might call a radical political alternative culture being created and institutionalized in New York City and centered in Greenwich Village. It will lead today, even today, to a place where Greenwich Village will have art theaters. It'll be the place where alternative cinema is shown. It'll be the place where, if you're involved in documentary films, you have an opportunity often to find a first-run house that will show it. And generally, if you want to find a second house, it'll be in San Francisco. In between the two, there's virtually none that you'll be able to find a sufficiently large audience. It isn't that there are people there who would see it elsewhere, but you've got to be able to fill the theater, or a theater owner isn't going to want to show the film. So New York becomes quite unique in doing this. The Communist Party USA has, by 1929, about 7,000 members, mostly immigrant workers in and around New York City. It includes people working in these textile mills. It includes people working in the garment mills. It will include people working in the new municipal trades, transit, social work, teachers' unions. It includes as well many artists. John Dos Passos, Howard Fast, Pete Seeger, Clifford Odets, Howard Da Silva, Richard Wright, Ring Lardner Jr., Elie Kazan, Erskine Caldwell, various novelists, playwrights, artists. They have a very famous newspaper. It's based in New York called The Daily Worker. Having said all that, the largest vote they ever get is in 1932 when their chairman, William Foster, gets a total of almost a little under 103,000 votes in the national election. It is a puny amount. The socialist candidate, Debs, gets 7 times that number that year, and he had twice that number when he was in jail in 1920. So the socialists have a much broader base than these communists have, even apart from the membership. We're not talking, in other words, about huge numbers, but we're talking about loud and very well organized numbers that have an influence beyond their numbers. They are committed organizers. They are actively anti-racist and lead the campaign for the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. Now, you should know when I say they're anti-racist that critics of the communists, the anti-communist historians, have argued that their anti-racism was just a political strategy, that they were as racist as everybody else. That's a debate in the historiography, and on the whole, the historians now tend to argue that these people were of their time. They tended to probably be in advance on issues of gender and race than others, though they were pretty patriarchal and pretty traditional, not so great on gender, but they were in advance of their times on issues of race. The Communist Party in the early years of the Depression sees the New Deal as its enemy. It describes it as social fascism. It is in fact opposed to the New Deal, which it argues is really conservative reform that is really just trying to salvage capitalism, which it still is opposed to. That's why the Socialist Party is getting much more support than the Communists are. They lead, nonetheless, campaigns to organize the unorganized, that the labor movement till then had been focused in the American Federation of Labor as a pretty conservative labor movement only among the skilled workers. That's to say, it tended not to organize women, they tended not to organize African Americans, they tended to be anti-Chinese, and they had no interest in organizing unskilled workers, all of whom were in the new mass production industries like auto, steel, textiles. They were not in the American Federation of Labor. It was a very elitist organization. The communists go after all those mass production workers. They organize the unskilled, the industrial workers, and they become the backbone of a new form of organization called the CIO. Okay. Congress for Industrial Organization, and it is based in alternative unions to the elite craft unions, and they try to focus their organizing in these mass production places. The most famous of these CP-led unions in New York City is the Transit Workers Union, which is led by two communist organizers, John Santo and Austin Hogan, who founded in 1934. But its main leader right through the 1960s, a person who will become very famous in New York City's history, is a man by the name of Michael Quill, an Irish communist nationalist. And I've mentioned to you that in the Entitlement library, the reading room is called the Quill Room. He has long left the Communist Party by the 1950s and the 1960s. But in organizing in the 30s, the Irish communists are the ones who are organizing these unions, these municipal unions. The TWU leads the fight to represent New York City's public transit worker unions. And they're able to do so after years of clandestine organizing. A series of small strikes and a sit-down strike in the BMT, the Brooklyn Municipal Transit's Kent Avenue powerhouse in 1937, and an NLRB election following that. The key is to understand that the transit workers lead the movement for the organizing of public employees in the United States. There had been some other efforts, and there would be other efforts by the teachers' unions and by social worker unions, and once again, it would be the communist-led unions in New York City that would become the backbone of those organizations in the 30s. That's to say, they become the center of a new constituency in a much more broader-based working-class organization that includes unskilled and skilled workers, immigrant and native-born, and for the first time, black and white, female and male. They form unemployed councils in 1932 and 33. That's to say, they organize people who are unemployed into organizations, and they lead the fight for jobs and for fair housing. In 1932, they lead rent strikes for the first time in the Bronx, in 3 large Bronx apartment buildings, to stop evictions. The unemployment councils lead the strikes and have sit-downs in these buildings. The courts rule against them. The courts rule for the landlords initially, but the police, when they show up to evict them, find themselves confronting militant tenants who refuse to simply be passive. The The women tenants are especially militant. And the police are put in the awkward position of having to physically remove women, which was something, given American patriarchal notions of treating women with respect, was especially hard and difficult, and created enormous bad press for the police if they were seen beating up on the heads of women. So it was a very effective strategy. The landlords give some leeway. Nonetheless, evictions accelerate through the Depression more generally because people are out of work. They can't afford to pay their rent. And so rent strikes spread from the Bronx into Manhattan, and sit-ins grow, and new hunger strikes, all kinds of new strategies, some of which had come out of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. That's where those strategies were born. They will be, as all of you can hear, the strategies later that will be adopted in the 60s. And they will be augmented by strategies that some people will have learned from people like Gandhi and others. So this is not the only impulse. There are modest wins for tenants, and a home relief bureau is started in New York City, which is part of what will later become the welfare department. The origins of what was welfare was actually something called TERRA, a Temporary Emergency Relief Act. It was a New York City-based and then New York State legislation that begins in 1931 before FDR becomes president. And that becomes, TERRA becomes FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Association, when Roosevelt's elected. So again, the model for relief was New York City and New York State legislation that Roosevelt brings with him from New York to Washington. And those relief organizations help to provide money to keep people in their homes. More importantly, yes?
Were you saying that there's a causal relationship between the rent strikes and the creation of TERRA?
Well, the rent strikes are actually following after that. The FERA and TERRA actually are before the rent strikes. The rent strikes, however, to be successful, needed resources, and one of the reasons they become successful is because the money is available that tenants have from FERA. Yes?
What does TERRA stand for?
Temporary Emergency Relief Association. Act. Temporary Emergency Relief Act. Sorry. In 1937, this kind of initiative leads, in fact, in the United States to a Housing Act, which provides money for localities to have low-cost public housing. And the legacy of that effectively becomes, in New York City, the development of rent control. New York State passes in 1942, FDR passes in 1942, rather, an Emergency Price Control Act. And New York State, again, all initiated, almost all affects only New York City. A little bit affects Buffalo and Albany. It's virtually all for New York City. Passes a temporary state housing rent commission when there's no longer a federal act in place. That's to say, rent control is virtually almost only a New York City policy. It's a New York State policy. It disproportionately affects only New York City, which has rent control and rent stabilization programs covering in New York City 1.8 million units after World War II. And as late as 1960, it covers 18 counties in New York. And today, it still covers Buffalo and Albany, but it's mostly New York City, and most famously New York City, that has rent control and rate stabilization programs. And that's the legacy of this New Deal legislation in action. The second group that acts from below and draws on the influence of this left-wing group of communists, but is distinct, is the trade union movement. Both the AFL in its Central Labor Council and the new CIO unions, which are led by communists but have a much broader base than communists. And they lead to the creation of public sector unions. And New York City becomes unique in the extent to which it has a public sector union movement in the country. A legacy with which we still live today in terms of possibility of strikes, higher wages, benefits, all kinds of things. It has its origins well before the 30s. New York City street cleaners organize in the 1890s for the first time and create a union. They even win grievance arbitration, and in 1898 they disband, and the union is largely forced underground. And only in the 30s and 40s do they come out from underground and they form groups like the sanitation workers, who reorganized in the 1950s. The transit workers, we already heard about. They organized in the 30s. The teachers' union in New York City is founded in 1916. It is a largely conservative, skilled craft union, and it's augmented by a dissident group that forms against it in 1935 called the Teachers Guild, led by communists. The social workers, they are organized again by the communists, both in the welfare department and in the private sector, especially in Federation of Jewish Philanthropies, but also in some of the Protestant, again in the 1930s. The hospitals become unionized. The social workers are unionized. The teachers are unionized. The police form a benevolent association in 1894. The firemen form United Fireworkers in 1917. And both take lessons from these other public employee unions in organizing. And in fact, the Boston policemen go out on strike in 1919 in a very famous strike by policemen. The point, again, is only to understand that New York becomes unique in the role that public employee unions have in America. All of these groups, the radicals, the reformers, the trade unionists, their real legacy is a new, broadened commitment to an idea of what constitutes the public. And that's what changes in New York City and makes New York, again, unique. And it emerges in the development of something called what we might call a municipal social policy. Not simply private policy, not policy that's federal policy, not policy organized by the state, but the notion that the local municipality ought to have a sense of common welfare for its people. At its core, of course, is the notion of regulation, that there ought to be no free lunch to the private sphere in employment, in housing, or even in street life. That fairs could be created that would close traffic, for instance, that the state could, it would be in the public interest to close off streets periodically in order to have communities have community events. That the state ought to be involved in building housing. And it would build some of the first public housing in New York City. We'll talk about in a minute. It was to suggest that the state was to provide jobs. That's to say, it was to presume a whole broadened range of entitlements for people. It did not mean an abolition of private property. Okay? Understand, when we're talking about this as a welfare state, this was not an abolition of private property. But it did suggest that there was a much broadened range to the public domain over health, education, housing, and public utilities. Air, water, electricity, power were now to be taken out of private hands. You all live with that today. It's Con Edison as a public registered utility. New York City water system, a public utility. There are other states and places, these are all privately run. We have a mass public transit system that emerges. Remember, this had been a private system. It's taken over by the state in dilapidated shape. And the state assumes responsibility for creating it as a public system. They take it over in 1940. They are forced in 1948 to raise the fare to 10 cents and 7 cents on buses. For it is now, unfortunately, in taking it over, it now becomes part of a municipal budget, which means there will be a downside to all of this. New York City will be one of the few places that in entitlements will also have a city tax. It's got to find a way, it's got to create a municipal budget. Part of its legacy is an old one we talked about from the 17th century. To do all of that, it has to ask permission from Albany. And Albany largely is controlled by legislatures who live outside of New York City, but whose constituency works in New York. So they don't want to be taxed for working here, and they're happy to have us tax those who live here. And so the pressure is to build a sales tax, so at least they have to spend some money, get taxed when they spend their money here. But that's a huge, to get permission for that requires the state to be involved all the time. The city makes New York City different than every other city. It makes old cities different often. Are two things. One is they don't control their own fate. Okay? It's often controlled by Albany and by Washington. Can't even set its own budget. Secondly, it's an old city. The article I had you read, it makes it different than a Sunbelt city. They can't simply decide that they're going to absorb Westchester County or Bergen County or Passaic County in order to change the tax base. Houston can do that. Dallas can do that. Los Angeles can do that, and willy-nilly they do it all the time. Okay? New York can't do that. The other states won't allow it to be done. So it has very severe restrictions on the things that it can do relative to other states. It has a mass transit system, and it has a mass transit system today. As you know, the fares rise, but on the whole, it has improved. By 1989, 1 out of every 9 mass transit workers in the entire country is on a New York City subway. Again, to have a sense of the scale of New York, 1 out of every 9 people riding a subway was riding a New York City subway. The MTA today is the largest mass transit system, and unlike virtually every other transit system in the world, it operates 24/7, and it has one fare. You can stay on all day. Any of you who have traveled in other countries know how prohibitively expensive and much more limited the transit system is. The legacy of that is a notion about a public and how a public was to be served. New York City would pilot the origins of family assistance, and it would always be more humane and generous in New York than elsewhere. It would have a different notion of entitlement in place. The program was based in New York. I mentioned Terra becoming Fera. Public housing programs originate in New York City. They originate as early as 1913, and they come out of the Jewish labor movement. The United Workers, formed in 1913, when a small group of socialist Zionist Jews create a co-op on East 13th Street. And they build in that co-op a cooperative kitchen with cultural programs in which people would share the space. By the mid-20s, this group, which has communist leanings, opens a summer camp called Camp Nijidegit, or No Worries, a place where you'd go in the summer, in Yiddish. In Beacon, New York, the notion that, in fact, they ought to be able, as part of a cooperative, be responsible not just for one's housing, but for a whole livelihood for its people. And in 1925, the Bronx housing complexion on Allerton Avenue is opened by them, called the Coops, or the Cooperatives, the Coops. It's a new film, actually, about the Coops that has just opened. The Amalgamated Housing opens in 1927 by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, which provides cooperative housing for 303 cooperators. It's now 11 buildings serving 1,482 people. It's all in Chelsea, north of 24th Street. and 8th Avenue. It included, again, educational programs and nurseries for tenant families from the beginning. It becomes a model for public housing. The origins of public housing come out of the labor movement, it's to say. New York City creates its housing authority well before the federal one. The federal one's in 1937. New York City has one in 1934. The first project is called First Houses. It's on Avenue A and 3rd Street today. It's a WPA project. It opens in 1936. It is the first public housing in the United States, and New York City will become the major developer of public housing. Though you all know how that story will become, and will read how that story will become complicated by Robert Moses. But Robert Moses, among all of his other sins, one of his virtues is that he was the most proactive person in getting federal money for the development of public housing for New York City. And New York City would vastly expand public housing beyond that which would be accomplished in any other city in the United States. With rent control, New York City by 1950 regulates 96%, New York State, of rental units and 80% of all housing in New York City. That's a whole different notion of entitlement and about state fairness. That's to say, the notion that the state, remember again, if we go back to a notion of a moral economy, it's the state presuming a different notion of what it means to be a moral state, that people deserve to have shelter and it needs to be regulated so that people can afford it. People deserve affordable housing. New York State pilots that idea. Like it or not, they pilot that extraordinary idea. At the end of World War II, the city accommodates 58,000 people in 14 projects. Between 1945 and 50, the city builds 21 more projects, and by 1960, it adds over 75,000 more units in public housing. Beyond housing, again, another notion of what constitutes a notion of a moral economy, a moral city. Education. The city creates the first major free public education city-wide system, CUNY. The largest unrivaled urban university system in the United States. It's created initially with 11 colleges. By the end of the 20th century, 6 community colleges, a law school, a graduate school, a medical school, and 500,000 students. It originates back in 1841 as a free academy, which became City College. By the 30s, it's known as the Jewish Harvard. Jews couldn't get into the other one. They came to CUNY, and as you know, it produced a large and disproportionate number of Nobel Prize winners. It was a free education for immigrant children in New York City, higher education. In 1945, the City Board of Higher Education ran 4 tuition-free colleges. When the GI Bill, then the federal state after the war, begins to expand the notion that the feds ought to have a role in free education, which the feds were willing finally to think about because they're supporting male soldiers. Okay? That's why it can become acceptable for the state, because we're providing it for male soldiers. It's like that early notion of veterans' hospitals could be supported. A limited role for the state. We get the vast expansion of education in New York City and elsewhere into the growth, the community colleges, the new 4-year schools, etc. In the wake, to be sure, after the 1960s of the civil rights movement, CUNY moves to open enrollment. And in fact, anyone can get into a New York City school who is a graduate of a high school, no standard whatsoever, on the assumption that people have been discriminated against, people of color, with a legacy of slavery and a legacy of discrimination in the workforce. It's argued that they ought to be able to get into a school now and be given a chance, be given a, quote, head start, as the federal program was called. We know that free and open program created its own problems. In the first year alone, 35,000 people entered. It had been 20,000 the year before. The problems and the response to that will be part of a story in a lecture, 2 or 3 lectures down from here. Nonetheless, it was and needless to say, they charge tuition today and they changed open enrollment. Nonetheless, its history was a remarkable testimony to public service and an effort, a commitment to the notion that we ought to be educating everybody. Finally, a municipal hospital system. Again, unparalleled scale and unparalleled range of services compared to anywhere else. The origins of public notion again in New York, go back to 1736 and the New York City Almshouse, the infirmary, which became Bellevue Hospital. So there's a long history to this. But by 1950, New York City, and again it is incredibly unique, had 22 municipal hospitals. No other city in the country had more than 3. So again, what we have is a notion of people suggesting that it is immoral not to be ensuring and guaranteeing that everybody has access, minimal access to health care. That you don't simply throw people who are diseased, who are injured, who have no shelter, who have no means of support out on the street without providing care. This was, if you'd like, municipal socialism. By the end of the 20th century, there were over 10,000 beds run by the New York City Health and Hospital Corporation. $5.4 billion budget that served 1.3 million New Yorkers, nearly 400,000 of whom were uninsured. 11 acute care hospitals, 4 skilled nursing facilities, 6 large diagnostic and treatment centers, and more than 80 community-based clinics. Now understand, they have been beleaguered, some have been forced to close, and we need to understand that their struggle, however, has to be seen, including that of the struggle of public schools, to contrast with private volunteer hospitals or private school systems, including this mystique of the charter school, which is a form of public-private school funded for the public sector, which can cherry-pick students. The public school system and the public hospitals turn away no one. They, by law, can turn away no one. The cherry-picked affluent kids, or the best kids, the smartest kids, those kids who don't have social problems, are free to go to other schools. Public systems must take them all and turn away no one. The public hospitals are defined by their inclusiveness, their continuity, their responsiveness, their visibility, their commitment to a public sector. Last thing, public cultural sphere that I began with. We talked initially about the film. By the middle of the century, with this legacy, New York City creates a public culture as well, and institutions for it. Something called a city center for music and drama. Public arts high schools. City broadcasting centers, WNYC, public radio stations, public broadcasting stations. Progressive policies, the creation of a public sphere will come to distinguish New York City, both to its proponents and to those in and outside of it who are its antagonists. It offers services that are relatively unique and nowhere more extensive in scope and in scale. Just as we shall see, with the subsequent history of efforts to modify and dismantle and make war on this in post-war New York. And those struggles will be the Cold War in New York City for next time.